Well, good evening and welcome back to Scuttlebutt Lodge and another episode of Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual. And tonight we're going to be lifting up the covers a little bit, lifting up the political covers and taking a look and see how this political sausage is made in our country. And tonight I have Derek Fildebrandt joining me. Derek is a former MLA, a Wild Rose MLA in Alberta. He spent just about as much time in the penalty box in Alberta politics as I did here in Ontario. And after getting squeezed out of the sausage factory with Jason Kenney, he got into the publication business and now is the owner of one of Canada's premier online independent media sources, the Western Standard. And it has been quite a week for political sausage making around the world and here at home. In the last week, we finally got a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, only to have the very same night that a ceasefire was called in Lebanon, that a new war started up in Syria. And then, of course, we've had Trump has said to Canada and Mexico, if you don't close up your borders, we're going to put on a 25% tariff on your goods. And of course, hundreds of thousands of Canadians have been yelling for the same thing for quite many years. But Trudeau ended up jumping on the plane and going down to see Trump at Mar-a-Lago pretty quick as soon as the Dawn made the command from Mar-a-Lago. So good to see Justin maybe taking some direction from Mr. Trump, although he doesn't take much direction from us right at the moment. Anyway, join with us tonight as Derek Fildebrandt joins us on Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual. Welcome to another episode of Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual. This week, we have Derek Fildebrandt joining us on the show. Derek was a longtime Alberta MLA. He was with the Wild Rose Party and then was instrumental in merging of the Wild Rose with the Conservative Party to form the UCP under Jason Kenney. As a result of Derek's good efforts in the Alberta legislature, Jason Kenney put the squeeze to him, and out he went. Derek is now the publisher of one of Canada's great independent media platforms, the Western Standard. So join us this Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern as Derek and I get together to talk and lift the covers of this political machine and see how they make the sausage that nobody wants to know about. See you then. Well, once again, thanks for being here. Now, also joining with us tonight is our wonderful co-host and housekeeping and jack of all trades, Lee Stewie, is joining with us tonight as well.
Hey, Randy, how's it going? Welcome to episode 7, everyone. Just in case you guys are first tuning in for your first show today, I'm just going to let you guys know how this is going to work. The last portion of the stream is going to be Randy and Derek answering your questions that were submitted to his website. But if you didn't get a chance to do that prior to the stream, you can send in a super chat on YouTube, and we will get to those at the end of the stream. If you're watching this on the replay, or if you're using another platform other than YouTube and want to donate, you can do so also at Randy's website, No More Lockdowns /donate. And then there's also a Twitter space at 9:30. And that's going to be on the No More Lockdowns Twitter account, or X, as some people call it, at 9:30 following this show. So yeah, tune into that to get involved some more and engage in some conversation.
Well, thank you, Lee. And of course, you hit the like and share and subscribe and get a few more people. It's great to see so many people joining with us on tonight's show. Jimmy the Greek from Niagara is on, and Crooked Lake Wilderness Lodge, and many great individuals joining us tonight. So let's, as I bring in Mr. Derek Fildebrandt, let me just say a few things here. Before Derek's got a good pedigree in politics. Even before politics, he was quite critical of the Conservative Party in Alberta at the time. He was also head of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation in Alberta, and the Conservative parties don't always act conservatively. So Derek was pointing out a few of those inconsistencies. But let's bring Derek on to the show, and thank you very much for joining us, Derek.
My pleasure. It's good to see you again, Randy.
Good to see you. It's been a little while. I think last time I saw you was in the last 2021 federal election. We were out having some good Alberta beef.
Oh, you were in Strathmore. It was in my old constituency. That's a town east for those from outside of Alberta. That's a little town east of Calgary. I used to represent in the Alberta legislature, and yeah, you were coming through on Maxime Bernier's tour, and I brought a bunch of my stuff to cover the event there. I did not expect to see an old Ottawa Valley boy like you there, and it's a dirty secret. I'm a refugee from Ontario, but I'm from a good part of Ontario, the Ottawa Valley, which to those in Alberta, I just want to assure you, has very little to do with Ottawa. If Alberta's ever its own country, I'm petitioning that the Ottawa Valley gets to come along with us as one of our provinces.
I think there's much in common between the Ottawa Valley and the people in the Ottawa Valley and people in Alberta. And I've known Derek for some time, back in his what do we call it? University days.
Well, you're one of your sons, Russell, and I. We came up through university together. So
right on. So Derek, you started off being very critical of the Conservatives back in your days with the Taxpayer Federation, but then you decided to join the swamp.
Well, people, everybody knows that mainstream conservative parties often act unconservative, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's a simple political calculus and pragmatism, half a loaf versus a whole loaf kind of thing. I can get that. But, a lot of people from outside Alberta would have a hard time appreciating how utterly morally and literally corrupt the progressive conservative dynasty had become in Alberta. It had been in power for just about 44 years before it was finally defeated and thrown from power. And it always had a conservative wing to it, even at its worst. Sometimes the conservative wing was dominant, like under Ralph Klein, particularly in the first 2/3 of his time as Premier of Alberta. But in its latter years, it had become a thoroughly progressivist party with a minority conservative wing. And, it was time for it to go. And I had been a pretty strong critic of it. My post, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in Alberta. Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta now, and I think overall, on balance, doing a pretty good job. But she had earlier been the leader of the Wild Rose Party, and it's the strongest critic of the progressive conservatives and the need for new government in Alberta. But she had, I can say, politely say, a moment of weakness, and there was a very long story short. 2/3 of the Wild Rose Caucus, which had become the official opposition, challenging the progressive conservatives for power, they defected to the progressive conservatives. And I lost my mind, quit my job, and ran for a seat to take out one of the defectors in the election that came after that. In that election, 2015, every single one of the floor crossers, so 2/3 of the official opposition caucus. So just for context, imagine 2/3 of the Conservative Party of Canada caucus quitting the Conservative Party and joining the Liberals. Yeah. That is equivalent to what happened. And so imagine Pierre Poilievre then sitting as a backbencher under Justin Trudeau. That it is literally that crazy what had happened. It was just absolutely nuts. So I went nuts, quit my job, won a seat for the Wild Rose. Every single one of the defectors was defeated. The Progressive Conservatives were defeated, but the Wild Rose Party itself had been very thoroughly weakened by its leader and 2/3 of the caucus, the entire front bench almost defecting to the PCs. And so the NDP ended up getting elected. And, for the first at least year after getting elected, I hated the PCs more than the NDP. I wanted a reckoning for the corruption that had happened morally, politically, financially. But, then eventually I think I matured a bit and came to see that, there were some good people still left in the PC party. The Conservatives had become the less dominant wing of the party, but that if we could at least bring that conservative wing of the Progressive Conservative Party together with the Wild Rose, we could build a coalition. And it was a rough road getting there, but we eventually did, and we got the United Conservative Party out of it. But I may have forgiven the Progressive Conservative Party, but there were certain elements of the Progressive Conservative Party that's certainly not forgiven me.
No, and I think just for that was I think Prentice was the first leader of the PCs when you were in opposition, or was that Redford?
No. So Redford was the premier of Alberta for much of the time that I was leading the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in Alberta. And then Prentice took over when she fell. Her premiership collapsed. They replaced her with Prentice. And under Prentice, that's when Daniel Smith and 2/3 of the Wild Rose quit their job in opposition and joined the government. Then he called a snap election to try and take us unprepared, because we literally lost our leader in most of the caucus. And so he thought he'd take advantage of calling an early election. At that point, Albertans just said, enough is enough. We don't care who we're electing, just not you. And as a result, we got the NDP. So, by the time I was elected, Rachel Notley was the premier when I was elected, the NDP. And the PCs were led on an interim basis by Rick McKay for one of their MLAs.
A good point that you made there before is that you said you despise the Conservatives even more so than the NDP for a period of time, and I would say that's because there wasn't much difference between what the NDP stood for and what the Conservatives were acting in, as well as a little bit of a sense of betrayal as well too. Not just
it was more personal, because especially after the floor crossing, because that we saw that as dirty pool. We saw it as just morally corrupt, that they would try to bribe their opposition out of existence. People got to understand, the Alberta NDP prior to becoming the government in 2015 effectively almost didn't exist. It was a fringe party. It normally had between 1 and 4 MLAs in a given election. They were the 4th place party until the giant floor crossing debacle that melted down the PC and Wild Rose parties in December of 2014. The NDP was not a serious force. It almost never polled above 10 or 12%. It was only after this giant explosion in Alberta politics and the Wild Rose ceased to be seen as the government waiting that people said, well, fine, we're voting for somebody. And then there was Rachel Notley. She was the fresh new NDP leader, and she came across well, and so people went for it. There were still differences between the PCs and the NDP, but not that big. But I got to say, even I didn't. The NDP was thought of better, even by myself at the time, at least, because the NDP, while they were crazy, we saw them as at least having principles. They stood for something, even if that thing was a bit crazy. We never thought they'd really act on it. Like, come on, it's Alberta, you can't do something that crazy. But they stood for something, whereas the Progressive Conservative Party, at least in its latter years in Alberta, stood for nothing but power. So in a weird way, even people like myself on the libertarian right, we at least have more respect for the NDP.
Right.
So how do you think the political parties put the screws, so to speak, to politicians who aren't playing ball? And I'm wondering if you have experience with this as well.
Well, so in my experience, obviously I'm not objective about it. I'm not a disinterested third party. I lived through it, but there was a lot of to make the unification of the Wild Rose and PC parties happen, we had to have I won't get into too many details. I can only say so much of how the sausage was made. Also, just we're talking about how the sausage is made. That's paraphrasing something German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck said in the roughly 1870s, 1880s. He said, laws are like sausages. It's best not to see how they're really made. And so we've kind of paraphrased that over time and adapted it to mean, politics is like sausages. It's nasty. And you want to keep that behind the scenes because it's just so damn dirty. We don't really want to see it. So, getting the Wild Rose PC parties together, we had a civil war effectively within the Wild Rose parties. I can't get too far into that. Many of the people are still around. But, yes, some guy in Germany, 1880, yes, Otto von Bismarck. Then Jason Kenney had to wage a similar civil war on the PC side to become the leader of that party, brought it together. Jason Kenney and I had acted as very close allies throughout the process because we both believed in the eventual outcome of a united Conservative Party in Alberta. But I had made some enemies along the way, and they threw everything they had at me. It was bruising, but not debilitating. But then at the end of the day, it got coupled with a redistricting of the different constituency boundaries in Alberta. And the NDP chopped my riding up into 5 different pieces. And none of the math made sense for that. But the politics did for them because they were able to put Strathmore, the area I represented, together with a place called Chestermere, also east of Calgary, putting 2 different UCP MLAs against each other. And I sat down with Jason Kenney in his office, and he said, all right, well, we want you on the team and whatnot, but here's the deal. So the other MLA was mixed with. She was a woman and a person of color. And in the UCP caucus at that time, those were not very common things. It was mostly white guys. Now, I was the youngest, by far, white guy of them all, but it was mostly white guys. And she was both a visible minority and a woman. She checked 2 boxes, and there was only 2 minorities and 2 women, and she was 2 of both of those. Right. So he said, okay, you got to move you and your family all the way down to Medicine Hat and run down there. You're not allowed to run in the nomination in your new combined constituency. And I said, well, what gives? You made this big thing about grassroots guarantee, let the people decide all in the nominations. And he said, I don't remember his exact words. He said, how would it look if a white, blonde, bearded redneck defeated one of our only women and people of color? And I just kind of swallowed, nodded politely, and in my head said, are we allowed to swear on your show?
If necessary, but
in my head, I didn't say out loud. In my head, I said, "Fuddle duddle, I'm done with this," and that was the last time we spoke, and the end of that, and it was the end of my time trying to play nice with the United Conservative Party. I broke off from there.
But just for people to emphasize here, so here you and Jason Kenney are working together. You both see the merger of Wild Rose and the Progressive Conservative into a more conservative party is advantageous and necessary. So you're working together to do that. But and you achieve that, which is no small, that's not a small thing to accomplish. To get different political teams to decide to work together. It doesn't happen frequently. No. And then you don't have enough check boxes compared to the other. And you're essentially shown the door.
I'll add some context to be fair. Internal political enemies. Like, I forget I'm paraphrasing Winston Churchill here, but he says, your opponents are in front of you. Your enemies are on the same side of the house as you. As you know, Randy. I mean, your most dangerous opponents are the people on your own team who have one reason or another to be upset with you. They might have a different ideological disposition. They might just not like your personality. They might be jealous of a position or covet something. There's any number of reasons. So, I had certainly built enough political enemies on my side, and so internal party enemies had come for me and thrown some dirt. So I had been sitting temporarily as an independent at the time, but Jason Kenney was very clear. I was going to be coming back there, and everything was good. Actually, days earlier, before he had formally became leader of the United Conservative Party, he called the MLA who I got this conflict with for the nomination there. He called her a ditz and a moron to me privately. But then just later, we're sitting down. He's like, I got to protect this ditzy moron because we need to show a little DEI, essentially.
Right.
And so that's what did it in. Now that conflict probably wouldn't have happened if they hadn't have merged our constituencies, and that was from the NDP side. But the NDP was very smart in their politics there to put different conservatives in opposition to one another.
But I think it's really important for people to understand what you said, that where the knives are, where the enemies are
they're always internal. They're always internal.
That was always my experience in politics. You could be engaged in vigorous discussion and disagreement with the opposing parties, but who was going to knife you was your own colleagues, and they did it to me plenty times. They also did it to many other people within. I had a good colleague, Michael Harris, got the HEFO while I was there. Peter Sherman was another one that got the HEFO, and basically anybody that had some conviction or had some principles is going to create some animosity and enemies within their own caucuses. And that's who's going to put the screws to you and get you out. So,
So, Derek, what do you think of newer populist parties like the Wild Rose merging with establishment parties? Do you think it's a good or a bad thing?
I'll give you the cop-out answer, but I'll try to give you a real substantive follow-up to it. It depends on the situation. It depends on the context. So I talked about the floor crossing that happened that actually got me into politics. That was not a merger. That was one party doing a dirty backroom deal to just try and take over another. And it ended up blowing both of them up because it just clearly looked as corrupt as it really was. That was a rare time where people saw how the sausage was made because it was just so public. There was no way to hide it. Everybody saw it. Everybody was repulsed by it. And they spit it out. And we just ended up electing bloody socialists in Alberta. There are times where it makes sense. I thought it made sense to bring the Wild Rose, the Progressive Conservative parties together, particularly if, one, to defeat the NDP. That was just such a necessity in Alberta. But I wasn't willing to just replace it with anything for the sake of it. It had to be something proper and durable. It quickly became apparent to me after the merger and Jason Kenney had won that it was seriously problematic. One of the problems was that when the party was created, it did not have a founding convention first to have its constitution made and then elect a leader. Because once you have a leader but no party constitution, that leader is going to write the constitution themselves to suit their own ends and hyper-centralize power. And that's exactly what happened with the United Conservative Party. So it had a kind of original sin where it elected Jason Kenney, and Jason Kenney essentially got to write the constitution. It was hyper-centralized. He controlled the nominations. So who's a candidate, who's not. So if you speak up against him in caucus, well, he can get rid of you and just not sign your nomination papers. Well, good luck running as an independent or for a small independent party. Both Randy and I have gone on those glorious suicidal kamikaze runs, and they're all fun, but they never work, really. The last time Alberta elected independent provincially was in like 1980. I wasn't even born the last time it happened. So obviously it didn't happen when I tried it. But sorry, I'll try to bring it back around to Leah's question. But then eventually the party, as we got into COVID and whatnot, and Kenney started enacting serious authoritarian measures during COVID, the members started to revolt. There was the independence movement brewing at the same time, also creating unrest in the party. You had a revolt in the party, and the members changed the constitution and essentially gave themselves the right to recall the leader. They fired Jason Kenney and brought in Danielle Smith. Now, while Jason Kenney was the leader of the UCP, not that long after we parted ways, I came to believe at that time that the merger of these parties had been an error, that maybe something like a permanent coalition of parties might have been a preferable outcome rather than a formal merger. And conservative parties do this in several countries. In Australia, you have the Liberal Party, which is not really a Liberal Party. It's a center-right conservative party there. The left party is called the Labour Party. Then you have the Liberal Party, which is the moderate center-right conservative party. They run in the big cities, and something called the National Party that runs in the rural areas, and it's more right-wing. In Britain, you have the Conservative Party in most of Britain, but in Northern Ireland, you have the Ulster Unionists who run instead of the Conservatives, and they're kind of in coalition together when they need each other. In Germany, you have the Christian Democratic Union, which is nominally at least the center-right conservative party. It stopped being so under Angela Merkel, but historically it was. They run everywhere except for Bavaria, which is a bit culturally distinct and is generally considered a bit more conservative than the rest of Germany, where you have a sister party, the Christian Social Union. So I started thinking maybe this was a better idea for Alberta, that the progressive conservatives run in Edmonton and downtown Calgary, while Rose should run elsewhere, that maybe we should undo the marriage, but there was no undoing it. But then in time, Kenney was ousted and democracy happened. Danielle Smith came to the leadership of the party, and it's actually been pretty good and united since. She just won 91.5% of her leadership at a review just a few weeks ago. So in the end, I went from believing it was a good idea to believing it was a bad idea to believing it was a good idea again. So when I say it really depends on the circumstance, it also might just depend on what side of the bed I wake up on.
But, you gave a good little history lesson, and I think it's important because you were just revealing, like in the UK, you'll have the SNP, you'll have the Ulster Party, you'll have various parties that will work together, on the right side of the spectrum, and also on the left. We don't have any understanding of that. I don't think we haven't seen any examples of that functioning in our history. Which
there have been small, isolated examples, and mostly at the provincial level. I'm going really far back into history here, and I don't want to get it wrong, but broadly speaking, when social credit was a rising anti-establishment populist party, and it had some kooky ideas at the time, but it ended up just kind of becoming a precursor to reform eventually. But in Alberta, the liberal and conservative establishment parties cooperated, at least changed the electoral system with preferential voting, thinking, well, our first places will vote for us, and then second places for the Liberals, and the Liberals second places for us, etc. That didn't end up working. There's been non-aggression pacts in elections before. Technically, BC literally just had one where the BC United literally just stood down. That was kind of a non-aggression pact. But we don't have, you're right, we don't have a lot of examples of this. It's not likely to happen for a few reasons. Is you have to have, both parties have to have something they can give the other. So hypothetically, the Conservative Party has nothing to gain by having a non-aggression pact, hypothetically, with, say, the PPC, because the PPC has no seats. But I think it actually would be a good idea, not that I have any expectation of it happening, but Quebec conservatism is so fundamentally different than Anglo conservatism. I think the Conservative Party should actually not run candidates in Quebec. They should have a separate Quebec Conservative Party that just runs on its own, just as they do in Germany with the CDU and CSU, in Bavaria, and then rest of Germany, and let those Quebec Conservatives do their own thing, have their own language policies, and do all their Quebec stuff. And they can coalition with the Conservatives if they're needed to form a government. But in the meantime, both parties could have policies that better fit their own constituents, rather than these giant brokerage parties in Canada that try to represent everyone and end up poorly representing everyone.
Right. But there was a couple other points that I just wanted to pick up on. You mentioned about independent. In the last general election here in Ontario, we did have an independent member get elected, Bobby Ann Brady.
Sorry, are you talking provincial or federal?
Provincial.
Okay.
So
Ontario actually has done it a bit more than Alberta. Alberta just doesn't do it at all anymore.
Yeah. It's still rare, but I also think an interesting point that you raised up to just restate again is the NDP was a fringe party for its entire existence in Alberta. And then lo and behold, it went from, one or two seats to majority government. And another really good example of how politics can be dynamic, and we never think of politics as being dynamic as a general statement, but what happened in BC just recently, and was was it the BC Liberals that just stepped down and folded to allow the BC Conservatives?
Yeah, effectively. The BC Liberals rebranded to become BC United.
Right.
And the Liberal name was angering, again, kind of like similar-ish to Australia. The Liberal Party was not the Liberal Party as we think of it. It was just in BC, there's always the left, so the NDP, and before that, the CCF. And then there's the anybody but the Socialist Party, which is anybody who's just not a socialist. And that's been the Conservative Party in the past. That's been the Social Credit Party. And then from, the late 90s, early 2000s on, it was the BC Liberal Party. And actually, under the first two terms of Gordon Campbell, was actually a fairly conservative, robust government. It was kind of an ally alongside Ralph Klein and Mike Harris. Yeah. But then it had drifted steadily left, and it had stood for nothing. But the name BC United was angering the conservative side of that. That it was a poor rebranding exercise. They fell off in the polls. And then I guess a guy who was kicked out of his party, similar to you and I, had a bit more luck in picking up the baton. John Rustad, like you and I, was kicked out for speaking out, not following progressivist dogma around global warming. He was kicked out over that, and for being just a general pain in the butt, I guess. And he took over the Mormon Conservative Party, which was beyond even a fringe party. It was a name and a couple guys at the time, really, and built it up, and it made it stand for something different. And when I tried to break out against Jason Kenney with the Freedom Conservative Party, which became again eventually the Wild Rose Independence Party, we were offering something different, but people were already set on change, and they had already picked the United Conservative Party for change. There was no changing that. And similarly, it was I think you were kicked out under which leader?
Under Ford.
Under Ford. So and was Ford already premier? I think he was.
Yeah.
And so I mean, there are more difficult circumstances under which to do that. But Rustad was very successful and able to, because the BC Liberal United Party was so bad, people saw it in a way that in Alberta, eventually people did turn on Jason Kenney. I was just a little ahead of the curve. People in Ontario haven't yet, I guess, turned on Doug Ford. He's pretty good at reading the polls, I guess. But in BC, they were able to create something dynamic and become the main opposition party and come within a hair of winning.
Yeah. No, I would say, you and I were probably both ahead of the curve on
well, you're still ahead of the curve. They haven't dealt with Doug Ford yet, so you're still ahead of the curve. They eventually caught up to me in Alberta. They haven't caught up to you in Ontario.
I think, Doug Ford had quite the lashing during COVID. He didn't handle that too well. A lot of people were upset with him during that, but he's kind of like, regained some sort of some support by eliminating bike lanes in Toronto. So
there's actually a point on this. I know it's not really a part of our discussion, but I think it's really, I've explained this to a lot of Alberta audiences, but I think it'd be interested for your audience, which I'm guessing probably a bit more Ontario, being Ontarians. a lot of, J.C. Kenney said at one point when his leadership was under siege, he was a few degrees less extreme than Doug Ford and on COVID lockdowns and mandates. And he said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, I don't know why you guys are coming at me. I haven't been as hard on lockdowns and stuff as Doug Ford, and Doug Ford's not in any trouble. And I thought long and hard about this, and I've done a lot of writing about it. And I said, that's because you're not. I thought if J.C. Kenney had been the Premier of Ontario, he'd still be the Premier of Ontario. And this goes back, we're going to get a bit meta. This goes back to the very different kinds of founding conservatism in both provinces. Both provinces have long conservative traditions, but they're fundamentally different. Ontario, the license plate at least used to be "Loyal She Remains," because Ontario was founded by United Province Upper Canadian loyalists, people who fled the American Revolution and its kind of Republican virtues that we now associate with conservatism. Because the fundamental values of Ontario conservatism are written in the Canadian Constitution: peace, order, and good government. Ontario conservatism, and I think your deviation to this, Randy, you probably belong a bit more with our kind of conservatism. But Ontario conservatism, I think, fundamentally prizes stability, continuity, tradition, those kinds of things. Burkean conservatism.
Yep.
Alberta conservatism, remember, we were not founded by United Empire loyalists fleeing the American Revolution. We were in large measure settled by Americans from Montana, some of the craziest kinds of Americans. We were settled by Germans, Ukrainians, Scots, people with a significantly less attachment to the British Empire and old Tory conservatism. So while Ontario conservatism is peace, order, and good government, Alberta conservatism is more revolutionary in its nature. It's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We're much less deferential to institutions and tradition and things like that. So there's a reason that Alberta conservatives' favorite pastime is knifing our own leaders. We get angry and we throw them overboard real fast. We create new political parties all the time. We created Social Credit. We created the Reform Party. We created Wild Rose. Even actually, a lot of the socialist parties, like the genesis of the NDP, the CCF, came from Alberta and Saskatchewan. Ontario doesn't invent new political parties. Ontario conservatism doesn't throw off its leaders. And I think it's just because while we both can have very good conservative traditions, they have very different founding myths and underlying values that we just don't think about on the surface very often.
No, I would agree with you on Derek. That's the cultural aspects and heritage are different. The last time Ontario had some sort of radical new party become government or even to gain substantive tracking, and they did win government. It was the United Farmers Party in, I think, 1919.
Which was started in Alberta. No, actually, at least on the West. I should maybe necessarily Alberta, but started in the West. The United Farmers Party. No, actually, I slightly disagree. The NDP held power from 1990 to 1995, and that was an experiment in a new party, but it's now become a part of the trilogy of the old parties. I think it's hilarious that the NDP, which federally is the second oldest political party in Canada, calls itself the New Democratic Party when it's the second oldest political party in Canada at this point. So yeah, but you're overall right. Ontario does not like to experiment with new insurgent or populist and anti-establishment movements.
Yeah, so far
it doesn't seem like Canada could get a Trump-like figure on the ballot here in Canada. And do you think your experience with closed primaries reflects that?
That's one of my favorite topics, primaries. Everybody's got their magic bullet for democratic reform in Canada. There is no magic bullet. But if the closest thing we can get to one, I think, would be a radical reform of the party nomination system. The American system has got its goods, it's got its bads, but I think its strongest point that we could easily emulate, relatively easily, would be how they nominate candidates. In Canada, most people wouldn't understand this. Political parties are actually private corporations. They're generally registered as not-for-profit corporations, and they're private clubs. And the public have effectively almost no right to have any say in how they're run. The most you can do is, if you're a member of a party, you can sue your own party as if you're a shareholder of a corporation. So you can sue a corporation for not following its own bylaws. You could kind of do that. But the party writes its own bylaws and gives itself any powers it wants. Whereas in the United States, political parties are a completely different conception. They're not private corporations. They're public institutions. And I think in this case, that's probably appropriate. And by allowing everyone to vote, in the States, if you say you're in Texas, you register as a Republican or you register as a Democrat. And if you're a Republican, you get to vote for who the Republican is. Democrat, you get to vote for who the Democrat is. And the party brass, they can have some influence. They can throw money behind the candidate they like. They can line up endorsements and good political consultants to help the people they like, but they can't ban the person they don't like. So in the Republicans, you had a guy like Ron Paul, who voted against all the wars. He voted against the Patriot Act. He voted against everything that came to define the neoconservative Bush era. And the Republican establishment hated him, but they couldn't kick him out. They could not. They had the right to kick him out of the Republican caucus, but there just wouldn't have been a point because he kept on winning the Republican primary and kept on coming back. On the left, you can get an AOC, who's a pretty hardline socialist and embarrasses the kind of corporatist Democratic establishment, or Bernie Sanders. And the biggest example was Donald Trump. The Republican establishment was terrified of this guy. They did not want him to run. They lined up money against him and consultants and endorsements against him, but they couldn't ban him from running. And in the end, he won. And I think, and as a result, America has to only have two parties but they have way more diversity within their polity and within their legislatures than we have. Here, if you're an angry conservative, you have to go create a reform party. You have to create a Wild Rose party or a People's Party. That's your only choice. Is either hold your nose and vote for someone you don't like, or go start a new party and split the vote, so-called. Or on the left, you got to go have an NDP or a Green Party or a Bloc or something like that. Whereas in the States, you don't need to go and so-called split the vote. It's just not necessary at all. You're angry and you're on the right. Go run it as a Republican. You can do it. And the same thing on the left. And I think I think that would be one of the best things we could have. It would make our politics much more democratic. And we'd actually have, even if we ended up having only two parties like the States, we'd actually have way more diversity of opinions and ideology and politics within our legislatures than we currently do under the strict party system.
That, Derek, is been one of my long-term goals, is to create an open primary system here. And I know many people are talking about constitutional reform and reform on the charters and, in all kinds of different things that people see as what ails our system. But I think the open primaries is probably the greatest thing, and I would also say a necessary step if we're ever to get any actual electoral reform in our country. We can go through the host. Kenny did kick out a bunch of the fellas in his caucus as well during COVID. People like Drew Barnes and Number. Every party, no party will permit dissenting views, and they're safeguarded and they're protected in this fashion because they remove you from the caucus. They will not allow you to run as a candidate in their party again, and not even the riding association can't even do anything effective in this fashion because the party ultimately owns the riding association and can disband it and seize their bank account. So the candidates, the riding associations are all captured by the leader of the party with that closed nomination process. I don't know if was there any discussion in your time at the legislature, or is there any discussion going on as far as you know in Alberta about having an open primary system in Alberta?
No, it's not really on the agenda. Maybe I should consider penning a few pieces to try to get it on the agenda. But you referred Jason Kenney kicked some guys out during COVID. I remember that quite distinctly because it was the first time I'm aware of in Canadian history where a confidential caucus meeting was live blogged. I was live blogging at Jason Kenney thought he got rid of me, but I was still in his caucus room the whole time. People were leaking to me every single word he was saying during caucus meetings. And we live blogged it live as he was trying to kick these two dissident UCP MLAs out of his caucus. And it proved to be quite politically painful. In the end, UCP MLA members amended their constitution, as I mentioned earlier, essentially gave them the right to recall a leader, and they fired Jason Kenney. And one of those MLAs both of them got invited back. One of them actually came back. The other one just kind of retired. But no, there's not a lot of talk about it. There was just before Jason Kenney went down, he started calling snap nomination meetings to get some of his loyalists nominated before he was gone because he wanted to protect them while he still could, so that they could focus on his leadership campaign. Once he was gone, a lot of UCP members in those constituencies wanted to have real open nominations because Jason Kenney or his people had disqualified challengers to his key allies in caucus. They just disqualified him, said, you're not allowed to run, effectively protecting his guys. But Danielle Smith I think she very much wanted to have open nominations, at least under the current process in those areas. But the party brass still held a lot of weight, and that wasn't able to happen. I think most UCP MLAs, most conservative people in Alberta, probably even nationally, would like something like this. I'm just not under I don't have a lot of hope that it'll happen because this would desperately weaken the power of leaders and party brass to control the politicians. There's a lot of ways to control a caucus. You can give promotions to cabinet and committees. There's all sorts of things. You can get literally, a lot of people don't understand how important having a good seat in the legislature is. People will kill for a good front row seat rather than being up in the nosebleeds. There's a lot of things you can do to exert influence and power. The single biggest one they have is the nomination process. You get too far out of line, the leader just doesn't sign your papers, and you're not allowed to run. If we took that power away from leaders, it would do a lot to help what ails the democratic process in Canada. But that's why it's not going to happen, is the leaders just have too much at stake. If they lost that power, every single leader of every single party would become a lot weaker relative to the members of the party and to the members of their caucuses. And so, I bet you a lot of MPs, MLAs, MPPs would like it, but their leaders are just not going to let it happen.
Yeah, well, there are, I would say, in my experience, I tried to push the concept of open primaries. And just for the audience, as Derek said here, our parties run the nomination process. And not to get too fine a detail because there's different systems in each of the American states, but that process is taken away from the political party itself, and the state electoral commission or some other body like that runs the nomination process. So the party can't just disqualify you, can't just remove you, and same with, it's not just the leader, but the as you call them, the party brass. I often call them the palace guard or the backroom boys that would orchestrate the removal of members. But if we want to get a Trump style candidate and keep them, that's what we need to have, is an open primary system.
Well, I just to play devil's advocate with what we both support here, sometimes it's ugly and you don't get a good result. We'll recall the midterm elections during President Trump's first term. A gentleman, I don't recall his name, he won the Republican primary, I think, in Alabama. And he was a very troubled individual who had a habit of... I don't want to get it right and get sued by this guy, but let's just say he had some very bad stuff happen with very, very young women that I think was even
That was
illegal.
Matt Gaetz.
No. That's another guy. That's another Republican.
Oh,
Matt
okay.
Yeah, no,
Because
no,
he
that's
just had
happened
controversy as well.
now. Yeah, that just happened now. But no, this guy won the senatorial nomination in Alabama. Now, voters in Alabama, the deepest of deep red states, actually grudgingly elected the Democrat here. They tossed that Democrat out as soon as that guy was gone. But in that case, no, the Republicans just didn't want him. He was a bad guy. And they said, if this guy wins the election, he will not sit with the Republican caucus. But the voters had every right to make this guy the Republican candidate, but the Republican senatorial caucus had the right to decide if he sits with them or not. And they decided this guy, and I think they were right. They said, this guy is beyond the pale. He just is not going to sit with us if he's elected. So sometimes open primaries for your own party, you can get a bad dude. And I also remember Republican primaries elected neocon warmongers for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, we had 2 terms of Bush. You had Romney, guys like this. They very often don't yield the results you want. So I mean, it's a double-edged sword, but at the very least, people who support a party are going to, on aggregate, the person they want rather than just the person that the party insiders at the top want.
So I think I want to kind of talk about the Western Standard, and so independent media like the Western Standard can cover political and cultural issues in a way that mainstream media can't. The mainstream media has lost sight of its role in the fourth estate. In your view, has the independent media begun filling the vacuum as the fourth estate?
I think we've already filled it. Now, how we're defining media, how we're defining mainstream media, alternative media, social media, these are all nebulous.
The big six, basically.
Yeah. I'd say a combination of, Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, transforming it into X. I used to not call it X. I thought that was silly until it dawned on me that, no, this is not just new ownership and it's a bit more free speechy. It's fundamentally different and awesome. So now I've actually started to call it X now because it's a different platform than it was. It's done a ton to displace the old legacy media, but the legacy media was already effectively dead by the time that happened. Independent media is, we almost have to stop saying the word mainstream media now because we kind of are the mainstream. We're more decentralized. There's more of us than just a few big players like Post Media, CBC, Globe Media, crap like that. But it started to really come of age. There was a great blossoming of independent media in Canada. We were part of, I think, that phase. We came around in 2019. It had begun. I guess Rebel News was kind of the granddaddy of it on the right. You had Canada Land on the left. But that blossoming of new independent media has since stopped because we have something called the Online News Act. And without getting too deep into it, it's the single piece of legislation passed by the Trudeau government I hate the most. A long story short, it just tried to confiscate money from Facebook and Google and give it to legacy media players on extremely dubious grounds. And Facebook or its parent company Meta said, if you pass this bill, we're just going to ban all the news from Facebook in Canada, Facebook and Instagram in Canada. And I even went before Parliament and pleaded and said, I know you're not going to kill the bill from something I say, but at least I don't want your help. Let me opt out of the bill because I don't want your help because I actually believe in their threats and I don't want their threats to come true. I don't need your help. And the Senate amended the bill. Even Liberal senators did, but they went back to the House of Commons and they realized that allowing media to not be subjected to this kind of government regulation would make us a scab, as if we were breaking a picket line of publisher solidarity. And so they kept it in. And this kicked all the media in Canada off of Facebook. And that devastated the ability of new media to get its voice heard and get established in an economical way. And so we've seen a very significant reduction in the growth of new media outlets. We were increasing our revenue 300% year over year. 300%. We were growing like mad until the Online News Act. And they essentially, we've had to tread water since. Now we've since had to diversify our revenue models and find other ways to resume growth, and we are. But we're not growing at 300% the way we were year over year before the Online News Act. So that's one of the very first things I'm expecting a new Conservative government in Ottawa to do, is to repeal the Online News Act, get rid of the government subsidies, obviously get rid of the CBC, but getting rid of the massive government regulation that's overtaken the Canadian media in Canada, that's turned us from free and independent journalists into newspaper versions of dairy farmers.
Well, listen, I'm really glad you brought that up. Like, there's not been much talk about the Online News Act, and I think that's been, was it 2 years ago now? That was passed, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only big player in the social media apps that has rejected has been Facebook and Instagram. They're the ones that are not allowing any news, Canadian news items to be on their platforms.
Well, actually, I'll just explain. It only applied, they wrote it in a way that it only applied to Facebook and to Google. There just wasn't enough money with Twitter at the time. Also, the left didn't, the Liberal government didn't want to regulate Twitter very much because Twitter was run by leftists at the time. Yeah. Now, I bet you if they're writing the Online News Act today, they'd probably try to put X in there, knowing that Elon Musk would reject their demands, and it would just essentially end X for News in Canada, which would be good for the Liberals. But yeah, the way the act was written, it only applied to Google and to Meta, and Meta owns both Facebook and Instagram. Okay. Google complied a little bit, but in the end, there's actually almost no more net new money because Google and Facebook canceled their existing financial agreements with media. So there's actually almost no new net money. There's just a hell of a lot less traffic because media can't use Facebook.
Yeah, and I've not seen any. There's been no public indication from outfits like Meta to lobbying to have that Online News Act amended or repealed.
Oh no, they've said they want it repealed, and if the government repeals it, they'll put the news back on Facebook and Instagram in Canada. And it looks like Pierre Poilievre and his party have committed to repealing it. And so I mean, TikTok, whenever Jagmeet Singh gets his pension, we can have an election. When we have an election, we get rid of the Online News Act.
But more to what Lee's question there, do you think the and I like the term legacy media better than mainstream media. I think it is past. I think it's in the past. So we shouldn't be referring to it as mainstream these days, but as something that once was. But their role, the freedom of the press, was so highly regarded and respected and protected as their role as the fourth estate. Do you see that independent media can do that role adequately, and are they there yet or not quite yet?
Look, I think the days where people broadly respected the media of any kind is over. I think the journalists I've got working for me at the Standard do great work, but do I think that 80% of the people in Western Canada are going to love our people and trust everything they say? No, I have no expectation of that. The future is in more niche, subdivided media, and that's good and it's bad. It means we're going to have media that's more responsive to people and to the market and what people want, and they can find something that suits their taste. The negative side is that, and this is both good and bad in and of itself, is that we're so siloed that we're not even sharing a similar common set of facts anymore. You can have, if you watched the CBC during the Freedom Convoy, you'd believe that a bunch of fascistic terrorists had stormed Parliament Hill and were about to execute the Prime Minister, and we needed to declare the War Measures Act. If you read the Western Standard, you read Rebel News, True North, things like that, you'd believe that there were some people angry about COVID restrictions and lockdowns and mandates, and they drove to Ottawa, and they were honking a lot, set up some bouncy castles and pools, and yeah, it was a serious situation, but hardly worth declaring a national emergency over. And so people lived in totally different worlds. Maybe one was right and the other one was wrong. Maybe they both had a bit of truth. But we're living, we're not sharing a common set of facts, and that can make a country very difficult to manage where we don't even agree what time of day it is. So that's maybe the negative side. But the plus side is that you don't have to just listen to one of a very small number of outlets or publications spewing propaganda, like when the CBC strongly tried to intimate that the Freedom Convoy was, Vladimir Putin was pulling the strings behind it. Patently false, patently defamatory. But it used to be that was the perspective you had to listen to. You had 3 channels, you had 3 newspapers, and that's it. Well, today you're able to find more diverse voices. But as good a job as say there's a lot of different independent media, and there's a spectrum of it. It might just be a podcast on its own. It might be a fairly developed mid-sized company like the Western Standard. We're very professional. We have strong sets. We have codes of ethics and journalism and standards our people are expected to follow on pain of their employment. But we're never going to have a monopoly ourselves on the media the way the old legacy guys did. That's gone, and it's very unlikely to ever come back in our lifetimes.
And you're finding new ways to replace that growth that isn't there now, and I suspect that all the other media, independent media, are facing similar sort of.
Well, yeah, we have to work twice as hard for half the money. We're also at a huge competitive disadvantage because we don't take Trudeau's federal media bailout subsidies. As far as I know, we are the only media outlet in Canada that's been officially cleared to accept to get those subsidies. We applied for fun just to see what they would say. To my surprise, they said we could have them, and then they asked if they could help me fill out the forms to get all the free taxpayers' money. And I said, no, I was just joking. Thanks a lot. They were a bit upset with me when I did that. But essentially, there's a lot of different subsidies, and it works out to roughly 40 to 50% of the salary of every journalist in Canada is now paid for by Trudeau.
Yeah,
and that's extremely dangerous. It's beyond dangerous. It's utterly corrupting to the bone for the independence and credibility of the media. Even if the federal government wasn't exerting any influence, the perception of it would corrode trust in the media, and they are exerting it. There was one British Columbia Liberal member of Parliament who commented on a Post media column, I think from the National Post, that was critical of the Liberals, and he said something, I'm going to paraphrase him, to the effect of, if it wasn't for us, your newspaper would be out of business. Wink, wink, be a shame if anything were to happen to your job. So, the Liberals make no bones of this, that they expect the media to toe the line, and some do more than others. But even if there was no influence being exerted on media here, the perception of it is corrupting, and it needs to end. And the very clear objective of the federal government's regulation, control, financial and legal and otherwise, of the media in Canada is to try and prop up the old legacy media players. Even though Post media is, at least parts of Post media, like National Post Opinion, is critical of the Liberals, it's a part of the price of propping up the rest of the legacy media, which tends to be much more supportive of the Liberals. And the Liberals are desperate to try and save that. But at this point, it's like trying to save the light bulb. Sorry, it's like trying to save the candle, 100 years after the light bulb's been invented. You can't put that tooth back in the toothpaste at this point. They can't save it, but they're desperately doing everything they can. And the legacy media, they know it. You talk to all the editors, publishers in the legacy media right now. They know Armageddon is coming, that there's going to be a change in the federal government within 12 months. And when that happens, the subsidies are gone. The Online News Act is gone. Regulation of it is probably, at least for the most part, gone. And most of their jobs are gone.
Yeah.
So we are reaching the last portion of the stream. I just want to remind anyone, if they have any questions for Derek or Randy, to please submit them into the YouTube chat with a super chat, and we'll get to those at the very end. And I think the last question I have for you, Derek, is do you think starting an independent provincial party like Wild Rose is an effective solution to change the political dynamic in the future?
Well, I have to answer that similar to the similar question you asked earlier about, should you merge? Well, should you start your own party and break out? It really depends on the situation. We have a first past the post or plurality-based electoral system. And, well, I don't believe there is such a thing as splitting of the vote. I also do believe there is such a thing as splitting the vote, and it depends on the circumstance. If you're, we'll speak from the right in general as an example, but this is equally applicable to the left. If the mainstream center-right party, it's never going to be good enough for a guy like me. It's probably never going to be good enough for a guy like Randy, and I'm guessing yourself as well. I don't know you, but I'm guessing you'd have a similar disposition. It's never going to be good, great, but is it good enough for you to take the step of creating an insurgent, anti-establishment party on the right or the left? The incumbent party needs to be true and welly hopelessly screwed. I really did not think the United Conservative Party in Alberta could be saved. I was wrong about that. The party I'd founded after partying with Jason Kenney, the Freedom Conservative Party, had merged with the Wexit Party, an independence party, creating the Wild Rose Independence Party. And in quite a few polls, it got up to 18 or 20%. It was literally almost catching the United Conservative Party in the polls as the UCP was collapsing under Jason Kenney. And I was of the opinion for probably a good 2 years after Jason Kenney got elected that the United Conservative Party had probably been a mistake, that we should probably work with the traditional progressive conservatives, but on the basis we discussed earlier of more of a non-compete, but that we probably do need a distinctively more Wild Rose party in Alberta. But the party, to my surprise, reformed itself. It threw out its leader and elected someone that I think was significantly more in line with the hopes and aspirations and political views of the majority of Albertans, which is Danielle Smith. Now, maybe she'll go off the rails at some point and suffer a similar fate. I don't know. But, creating a rival party on the right is a very dangerous thing to do. At times when it is necessary. The Reform Party of Canada was necessary. But its merger with the Progressive Conservatives to create the Conservative Party of Canada also became necessary. The creation of the Wild Rose Party in Alberta was necessary. But its merger with the Progressive Conservatives to create the United Conservative Party was necessary. It took a few iterations before it got to where I think it needed to go. But, just my advice would be, do not do these things in haste. Don't do them in anger. They have to be done after you have exhausted all other reasonable options. And then even after you've done it, sometimes you need to swallow your pride and make peace with that old enemy if it's necessary.
Well, I think I would disagree a little bit. I think where there's really an unfulfilled marketplace, and I think you described it well. People on our side of the fence, the mainstream Conservative Party is seldom is it even good enough, right? But we, and I think Reform was a good model. Had they stayed as a Western based,
that's a different conversation, and I think I know where you're going, and I think I agree.
Yeah. So not dissimilar to the Bloc Québécois. There is, I think that would be a real healthy political environment for all Canadians if we saw, regional or provincial-based federal parties or regional-based federal parties. I think that is a very workable solution, and I think that can would also breed and cultivate that a similar viewpoint as what we described earlier in the show with the UK Parliament, and possibly, who knows, maybe some of those parties might embrace the idea of open primaries as well.
I actually think you're right. In the case of the Reform Party started as Western, but then they wanted to be national. They wanted to just replace the Conservative Party, the old Progressive Conservative Party under Mulrooney and Campbell everywhere. I mean, if I was around at that time, I probably would have supported it, but I think I would have been wrong. I think that was a mistake. I think the Reform Party should have stayed as a regional Western party representing Western interests. And in that case, it would have been offering something not just something more conservative than the old Progressive Conservatives, but something completely different entirely. Just the Bloc Québécois is something. The Bloc Québécois is a party on the left, but no one ever talks about merging the Bloc Québécois with the NDP or the Liberals, because it is a fundamentally Quebec party before it's even a leftist party. And so in the case of Reform, if Reform had stated as its primary raison d'etre to be a Western party representing Western interests, then there would have been no point in merging. But once it went national and it decided it wanted to be the government of Canada, and that failed after a few elections, then merger with their old rivals, the Progressive Conservatives, then that became necessary.
Well,
have you been to any Ottawa airport bathrooms lately?
Yeah. Do you know what the joke is?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I'm asking.
Yes. It's about we're at my home office at my office in downtown Calgary. Half an hour away here. I keep a tampon there that Justin Trudeau gave me that was in the men's room. I was coming back from a conference in Ottawa, I guess in the spring, and I was waiting for a plane, and I went to relieve myself before getting on the plane, and I was doing what I had to do. I looked over, and I just did a double take. I said, "Holy scheisse! That's a tampon." There I am. That's a tampon machine in the men's room. And the Western Standard reporters had reported on this that Justin Trudeau was installing free tampon and maxi pad machines in federally regulated men's rooms in Canada, so airports, military bases, places like this. But I only believed it in theory. I never thought I'd actually see it. So I thought it was hilarious, and I took one as a memento, and I keep it. I keep it on the bookshelf in my office downtown. And one day, I think when sanity returns and we're no longer taxpayers aren't paying for tampons in the men's room, I'm going to donate it to the Glenbow Museum here in Alberta, and we'll put it under glass, and we'll just talk about the insanity of the era with Yeah, well, it'd just be emblematic of the insanity of the period that I think we're emerging from right now as people start to get their brains back.
You think we're emerging from the sanity, Derek, and truly?
I do. I do. 2024, all of 2024 has just had a different feeling. For, I don't know, when you want to start the woke era, there's a lot of different points you can put it at, but whatever, it's 10, 15 years, whenever it was, the extreme progressivist left have imposed a false consensus by fear. We're going to cancel you. We're going to call you a Nazi. We're going to call you all these things, and we're going to destroy your life. And it's been oppressive, not just to people on the right, but genuine liberals. Think of guys like Bill Maher. He is a liberal. He's a center-left liberal. And guys like him eventually just have had enough. And people have been kind of throwing off the shackles of this. People have been getting more free. Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, transforming it into X, I think we're going to look back as a watershed moment, possibly in human history, for free speech and liberty. Donald Trump, his election means a lot of different things, but I think it was a fundamental rejection of identity politics, race, sex, and gender-based politics. I think it's happening here. People are just sick of it. They're done with it. you cannot simply point at someone and say racist anymore and end their careers. That's over. And the pendulum will probably swing back at some point, but I think the left is going to need to find a new playbook. They're going to have to find new sets of issues, because I think they've fundamentally lost right across Western civilization, and it's just getting good now.
Well, listen, we're going to have to leave. We have a Twitter space to get onto. Are you going to be joining on the Twitter on the X space? I guess I shouldn't say Twitter space.
It's 9:20 where you are, but it's 7:20 where I am, and I've got some hungry kids I have to attend to. So unfortunately not, but I'm grateful. I've enjoyed the time with you, Randy, and it was nice to meet you, Leah.
Yeah.
You too. Thank you so
very
much.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it. And for those, before we say good night and jump on X, Lee, anything else you need to add in, or
don't forget to hit the like button. Share this, helps with the algorithm. So yeah, on your way out, don't forget to hit the like. That's about it for me.
And if you want to join me at Scuttlebutt Lodge, there's a go to nomorlockdowns.ca if you want to spend a little time this winter or spring or summer or whatever. And of course, for the complete uncensored and unfiltered, join us on our Substack channel as well. Thank you all for being on Canada, a User's Guide and Owner's Manual tonight.